Good afternoon. This is a commentary on lecture 27 of the Foundations of Esotericism. Only a few more to go, and as I keep saying, each lecture gets more and more complicated in its repetition of ideas, but also taking further steps in the connection between consciousness and evolution. So the idea of consciousness, life and form, also how that then takes place now as creation. If you imagine in this lecture cycle, Steiner had now been giving lectures just about every day over the last month. There were a few gaps, so he'd been going for longer than a month on a daily basis with this group in Berlin, who were a select group of students in the Theosophical Society to try and deep found these ideas that were the basics, the building blocks of esotericism, in combining Eastern esoteric ideas, Western esoteric ideas, Christian esotericism, and then what was the foundations for his own Western esotericism called anthroposophy. So here in this particular lecture I have had to actually write a little list of 7 themes that I think come up in this particular lecture. The one is the 3 kinds of creation, and then how the 3 logoi, so the first, second and third logos, work into that. But also then in a second part of the lecture, the consciousness of the 4 kingdoms and the reverse consciousness of the elemental beings, where the laws of science are the consciousness of the elemental beings who have their body embodiment in the spiritual world or in the astral world, and their consciousness in the physical world. And then another level of how we can work with the creation of detrimental and positive elemental beings in our astral bodies, and how that works in our biography, and also how that works through art and ceremony. So huge themes. In a way, there's almost, you could say, 3 major parts to this lecture cycle, and so it's good to see that in creation. He brings the example of, let us try to imagine 2 points in our solar system. The one is before Saturn began, and the other is just before Vulcan is about to end. So the sort of the very beginning seeds and the end point of our evolution of consciousness that we are right at the center point in right now. And he says, imagine that it is like a sleep. So when there's a chain, he says it's like waking up in the morning, not having done anything yet, and there's only the memory of what we did the previous day is in our mind. That's something really important as one of the forms of creation. But he talks about these 3 levels of creation, or the 3 types of creation. The first type is that of combining of existing parts, where we create a new form out of old forms. So the concept of form, we'll see form, life and consciousness are very important concepts in the 3 levels of creation that are working with each other at all times. We will bring this back together. So the third logos, that is the third expression of the third logoi, works with the combining of forms. So we make a whole out of separate parts, a creation within a form. Then we also come to a second level, which is producing new formations with new life content out of existing foundations. He says, for example, this is how a flower comes forth, how leaves bring forth blossoms and then bring forth flowers, etc., etc. So all from the plant root. A flower is not put together like a machine by combination, but must grow out of what is already there. This is the creation out of life, and is the work of the second logos. And then there is the combination of the third kind, which is the production out of consciousness, which we've had before as a theme, the creation out of nothing or out of memory. So we can't say that there's nothing there, he says. Of course there's something there. It is the memory, it is the previous existence, but it doesn't come out of existing form and out of life. It comes out of consciousness. And that's quite an important one, and that's the consciousness of the first logos, the creation of the first logos. So the third logos produces by means of combining. When out of substance something new and living comes into being, is brought by the second logos. Whatever we have to do with the coming forth out of nothing, we have the first logos. This is the one who is the hidden things in themselves. The second logos, the substance dormant in things which creates life out of the living, and the third Logos, the one who combines everything existing, who puts the world together out of things. So there's an interesting way of looking at these three dynamics have to work with each other all the time. There isn't only one type of creation. So again, if you have an evolutionary theory that sort of speaks of things combining out of chaos, or if you have a theory of evolution where there's just a creator God who just said things, we have to actually take into account these three different dynamics of consciousness, life, and form. So again, the seed idea that was there before Saturn, but then also the seed ideas that will come about at the end of our great evolutionary cycles, that will be the nothing, the memory of this evolutionary cycle that will create on into the future. He then moves on into the existing of the mineral, plant, animal, and human kingdom, and where our consciousness is. So he says the human consciousness, the I am, is conscious within the human being. In the animal, it goes up into the soul worlds. In the plant, it goes up into the lower spiritual world. In the minerals, into the higher mental plane or the higher spiritual worlds. But he also talks about, in reverse, there are then the elemental kingdoms, the four elemental kingdoms that we need to talk about. So we have the physical, the water, the air, and the fire. But then we also have the ethers, the warmth ether, the light ether, the chemical ether, and the life ether. And that these ethers actually have beings, just like human beings, animals, plants, and stones. They have their embodiment in higher planes, and their consciousness is in the physical plane. And this is quite important for us to realize with the formation of matter, that these four, we have the salamanders who are connected with fire, the sylphs that are connected with air, the undines that are connected with water, and the gnomes that are connected with the earth. And that these beings, the physical laws, this is quite interesting, he says what the natural scientist today calls laws of nature are the thoughts of beings who think on the physical plane but have their bodies on the astral plane. So when we're thinking of the elemental beings, their bodies are in the soul world, in the astral planes, but their consciousness express themselves as the natural laws within earth, water, air, and fire. And that this is then something that we can manipulate. And he says something quite interesting. This, I suppose, might be a broadened consciousness of, where we are going as a humanity in our connection with our impact upon the other kingdoms. There's a great push for people in the world, among some people, not to eat meat, and some of the justification for that is the cruelty that is caused to the animal kingdom by being able to harvest meat in the way that we do today, in the way farming is done, or some forms of farming are done. And people are sort of saying, well, we should go to vegetarianism because, the vegetables don't have the same sort of sentient nature as the animal, and of course in the mineral world as well. However, quite interestingly enough, Steiner does actually talk about these things that, as we go to the next lectures, we'll see that there are actually effects of the human being upon animals, plants, and stones that create pain and have a consciousness of pain in our different way of working with them. But so too when we work with the elemental beings. So for example, he says here, we have around us beings who actually have their consciousness in fire. In the Sanskrit is known as Agni. You may have heard of Agni Yoga. Agni is the leading king of fire, so to say, the leading, most developed being of the fire elementals. And when we kindle fire, we cause pain to those consciousness. For when we do kindle fire, we cause a certain alteration in the body of the being in question on the astral plane. So when we make a fire, we actually change the embodiment in the soul world, and that causes pain to that being. So if we sort of extrapolate from that effect, we can't think that anything that we do in the spiritual world doesn't change the form or the consciousness of something. When we dig in the soil, sometimes that change in consciousness is a pleasurable feeling, but it can also be a painful feeling. So we can cause pleasure and pain in the animal world, we can cause pleasure and pain in the plant world. We just don't really have the organs of perception to be able to record that properly yet. Some people actually do feel that and have recorded it, but a lot of people wouldn't take that as something that is provable. And so too in the mineral world, but also in the realm of earth, water, air and fire, and in the elemental states that are behind that. And then this sort of links in with a comment made earlier that, when we do things in the world, we obviously create beings in our astral body, in the astral world, and we have the capacity also then to create positive beings. And he talks about in a particular way with rituals and through art. So in rituals, through definite acts, the aim is to produce not contradictory but harmonious being. And art consists in working harmoniously upwards from the physical to higher planes. So instead of creating contradictory beings purely by doing things in the physical world, we also have the capacity to work through ritual, through art, to create astral beings. So he says, for example, when a priest makes a particular movement and accompanies them with a definite sounds, with an intensification of the repetition, positive astral beings are created. Whereas if we just speak and make gesture with our hands, we have the capacity also to create detrimental beings within our astral body. So through art and ceremony and ritual, we can actually have the opportunity to create balancing and harmonious beings in the elemental world, and which kind of come as a balancing effect to those which are he says, when we do this or that, we are continually peopling the astral planes with beings. If we think these thoughts through clearly, we have the meaning of church ritual. So some of these beings are harmful. So for example, it says when we kindle fire, we can actually cause pain to the fire beings if it's just done arbitrarily or without purpose. So by bringing purpose into our actions, purpose into our words, purpose into our changing of fire, earth, air, water, plants, animals, human beings, we then also can create constructive elemental beings that can work for the harmony of the human being. So, for example, he says in some religions, and he brings the Zarathustrians example, they sought through sacrificial fire, they sought to create definite forms on the astral plane. All the deeds are accompanied by astral beings, and these bring about our karma. So when we inscribe counteractive and complementary astral beings through our actions, these are the things that then, these are the beings, the elemental beings, the astral beings, that start to bring towards the transformation. We don't only leave physical deeds behind, we also leave behind deeds in the astral plane. So whatever happens on earth, when all physical matter is worked over and the earth has dissolved through to the next astral globe, we will arise of itself. It will simply be there as astral beings as the effect of all the earlier physical processes. This is our karma. This is why we must work with karma. So in our next life, this is where we see the two working together. In our next life, we must put right again the grotesque astral beings that we have botched up. Otherwise, they would produce meaningless creatures for the next expression of the earth. This is the karma that we must rectify. So we need to take account of that in a small way in our own life, but in a bigger way on the earth. And so here he concludes then with this very particular thought that I've been working with quite strongly over the last months. Everything that one gives physically to the infant goes over into our astral body. It is present in the shape of definite forms. What is thus worked in is, however, gradually worked out again. In advanced age, the sins against the child must have their revenge. These sins remain throughout the whole life and have great importance, particularly in the final years. In the middle period, a sort of reversal takes place. The astral then works into the physical place. In childhood, the foundation of what a human being will have in old age is implanted into the astral. When a person perceives how they have been sinned against and works upon themselves with this in view, they can then eliminate the damage in the astral body. Otherwise, they will break down in old age under the weaknesses of the childhood. Only what a human being works into it consciously has a balancing effect on the astral body. If later in life the opposite qualities are not called up consciously, one cannot rid oneself of the failings. And he draws a little drawing with 45, the age 45 is the middle point of life. So in the first 30 years of life, we put things into our astral body, and they're kind of a poison for us, including the food, the cultural inputs, all the different things. And if we don't, after the age of 45, start to place counterbalancing effects, so to say. So we have in the first part, in our childhood, in the first 30 years of our life, things that happen in our being that create illness-bearing qualities. I mean, there's obviously also things that we can put in that are positive, but we have to take into cognizance that the things that is interesting says the sins against the child have their revenge. So certain things that have been put into us in nutrition or media or social formings have a kind of an inscript, an astral inscript that some of them are counterproductive. And if we don't, after the age of 45, start to inscribe into our astral body the counter-moral effects and the counter-noble effects through our deeds in the world, which include things like meditation, ritual, art, all the things that we've been talking about, these things that were inscribed into the astral body will gain more and more hold and make us ill, so to say, he says. One cannot rid oneself of the failings unless we put the opposite qualities up consciously into our astral body as a balancing effect. So that's quite a little bit of an interesting question. It's a question I wish I had had more present in myself when doing some of my biography workshops, especially for people who have passed the age of 50 or 60, to say, well, what are you feeling as the consequences of your childhood, say the first 21 years of your life, that was put into you as food, as cultural input, as education, as media, all these things, what's been put into you, and how do they sit in you as a force that is holding you back, burdening you, creating old age, creating a breakdown in the physical body. And what have you been doing to balance that by inscribing consciously into the astral body the complementary pictures? This is one of the pictures that we have had of in these lecture cycles of the evil that when we I don't know if we've actually come to that lecture yet, where he talks about the taking in of some healers. I think I've mentioned this before. Might have been an earlier lecture. I'm starting to get confused. There's so many lectures. That some healers let snakes bite them so that they can take the poison into themselves and create the antidote. And then when they meet people who have been bitten by snakes, they can use they spit to become the antivenom, so to say. It's a very important gesture in this, is that things are put into us to swing us to a certain pendulum swing to do with, so to say, or at some points Steiner calls this evil, but things that actually burden us, bog us down, or sins against the body, or sins against the innocence of the human being. And then we need to find the inner work to bring ourselves back to the center with complementary images so that we can become healers. The wounded healer comes from this sort of impression, but we have to actually allow certain things into ourselves. This is in no way saying anything that happens to a person that is harmful is okay, but things that are harmful to us do happen. And when we work with them to find the inner ennoblement of that one-sided gesture that's been pushed into us, we start to build these other astral beings that are then the healing forces. So there are some interesting thoughts for us to do, to speak with the three types of creation forces that we need to work with the whole time: the form, the life, and the consciousness. So when we can bring forth things by putting forms together in a new way, human creativity is that we put two things together and create a table or a chair or a motor car or clothes. But then there's also where we can take one level of life and transform it into another level of life. And I think this process of taking something into the extreme pendulum swing of something that is actually poisonous to us, and then finding a new form to place in itself, is actually taking one level of life, allowing it to mature, finding the ennoblement gesture, and then allowing it to come out as something that's healing, is a transformation of the second level of creation. And then there's the third level of creation that works along with the whole time, which is the creation out of nothing, where we don't have substance or form or life. All we have is consciousness. So the picture that Steiner gave, that I gave at the beginning of this commentary, is like when we wake up in the morning, we haven't done anything yet, but we have the memory of our action yesterday that starts to feed into our action today, is a little bit of this type of creation. So something that we may need to consider, how do we do that in our life? How do we allow an idea that actually has no form to build on, no life to build on, but can now, out of a new idea, work into creation as a third force of creation? These are the three logoi, the three levels of logos that work into creation all the time. So it's not just a random thing of evolution where things just happen together, and it's not just a singular creator being that says do this and it happens. There's actually a threefold dynamic in evolution through consciousness, life, and form that we human beings also participate in through this taking in of things early in our life, going to an extreme with the pain and the suffering, and then in the later part of life also transforming that through hard work to the ennoblement of counteracting things that create complementary and healing beings in the soul world that we can then work out of in this way. Okay, rather complicated lecture. We're getting towards the end of the lecture cycle. Hopefully that also means we're getting towards the end of isolation around the world. That was part of its intention, to be a counterbalancing spiritual work to all the things that we're having to face on a physical plane. Okay, cheers.